And we're continuing with Chapter 6 of The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult by Maury Terry. Catch 44. Detective James Justice had absolutely no idea that anything of interest was about to come his way as he waited for the Yonkers police operator to return to him. This call was strictly routine. He tried 4 times to reach Berkowitz without success. For all he knew, the man was out of town. The supervisors wanted the witness thing cleared up, so he'd asked the Yonkers cops to notify Berkowitz and have him call the 10th. Then Justice could get on with more pressing matters in the investigation, specifically the matter of the yellow VW. In a moment, a new Yonkers operator was on the line. 82 Police Headquarters 82, JJ. Yes, this is Detective Justice from Brooklyn Robbery Squad, New York City Police Department 82. Yes, JJ. I'm working on the 10th homicide zone now on the 44 caliber killer 82. Yeah, ... JJ. And I'm trying to contact a party that lives up in Yonkers who is possibly a witness to the crime down here. That's a Mr. David Berkowitz, 82. Oh no, ... Oh no, ... JJ, do you know him? 82. Could I, ... I was very involved. This is the guy that I think is responsible, JJ. David Berkowitz? Justice might have thought he'd wandered into the Twilight Zone. Berkowitz drove a Ford, not a VW. 82... is responsible. My father was down there Saturday. JJ, yeah, ... 82... And you also got some information regard ... Is he 35 Pine Street? JJ, yes, dear. 82. David Berkowitz, I don't know how you or what, but my father went down to 109th, and you also. Someone received information through our police officers, and that's because of some incidents involving shooting where we have reason to believe this person is responsible. He also has written similar type threatening letters to the sheriff's investigator who recently moved into his apartment. So I don't. JJ, do you know David Berkowitz yourself? 82. I don't know him. Because of a shooting incident at my home and a firebombing and threatening letters. JJ, at your home? 82. And through investigation found out that this probably the person. 82. Oh, JJ. Did you notify the police department on it? 82. Oh yeah. There are numerous reports on it, and information regarding this guy was given to your department on Saturday. JJ. Yeah, well, I am doing it another way. He got a summons down here that night, right in the vicinity. 82. Oh my God. Because we have seen him and he fits the description. That's why my father went down there with the whole file of copies of letters his whole file of copies of letters we have received from him, and I believe the Westchester County Sheriff's Department is now investigating him because he threatened a sheriff's investigator. My dog was shot with a 44 caliber bullet. Oh really, JJ? JJ, oh really? 82. At least that's what supposed to have been. The people who have seen it claim it was 44. JJ, 82, laughing. He just scared me to death. Now you are telling me he's a witness? JJ, well, we don't know. A possible witness, and from what you're telling me, a possible perpetrator. 82, and he owns a yellow car. JJ, he has a yellow, yeah, I'd say a yellow Ford, I believe it is. 82, yeah, yeah. Do you, the 109th, is that Brooklyn? JJ, no, that's Queens. We're working on it out of the 10th homicide zone in Brooklyn. 82, okay. Well, he went. My father went to the 109th on Saturday last week. Someone was up here at our intelligence unit and at that time spoke with officers Intervallo and Chamberlain, and they gave him information just on a long shot because he does resemble the picture. I don't know him personally. All right, 82. All right, so you know Berkowitz, 82, right. JJ, the through 82. Incidents have occurred that I have reason to believe that you could prove in court that he's responsible for a shooting incident at my home. JJ, Yonkers had at home and believes Berkowitz responsible. 82. He happens to be. He either was or is now employed as a rent-a-cop, like a security guard. JJ, rent-a-cop? You say you use the same terms we use down here, huh? 82, yeah. JJ, your dog shot. 82, with a large caliber bullet. It's never been confirmed because you know how it happens, right? 17 people have 17 different jobs and nobody gets together, and it's only in the last week that these two cops and I got together and put the reports together and got the Detective Division, DD, reports where he is doing everything. JJ, let me ask you something, honey. With his name, do you have a pistol license bureau up there that would... 82. Okay, supposedly he has a permit to shoot by New York City or has an application now being processed in relation to this. JJ, in New York City? 82. He holds no permit in the city of Yonkers at this time. JJ, but possibly here in New York City. 82. Possibly because he was employed as a security guard. Well, you know who you should get in touch with. And if you will hold on a minute, I will find out when he's working. All right? It is either police officers Chamberlain or Intervallo who, for their own reasons, put this all together, just because it happens to be their sector where I live. Chamberlain or Intervallo? 82, yes. The previous one was JJ. JJ, would you be able to do me the honors, please? 82, well, I'll find out where they are. They are not working right now, I know that. Can you hold on a minute? JJ, all right. Justice, on hold, speaks to people in his office. JJ, I have something beautiful here. I want to talk to this guy about a summons. Lives up in Yonkers. I was talking to Yonkers to get a notification made, and she says, oh, not him. He shot my dog with a .44 about a month ago. He's crazy. He's sending threatening letters to the deputy sheriff's office. 82. Could I get your name and have someone call you back? JJ. All right. My name is Justice. I'm thinking about what the hell number to give you. I'll give you this one, 946-3336. And that's a 212 exchange. Can I ask you a favor, honey? Operator 82. Can I get your name, please? 82. Sure. My name is Carr. C-A-R-R. JJ. First name, honey? 82. Wheat. W-H-E-A-T. Now, my father is Samuel Carr. He went down there with all the information the other day. JJ. Where do you live, Miss Carr? 82. 316 Warburton Avenue, and that is immediately behind the back of his house and the back of mine. Face each other. There is also a Westchester County Sheriff's Department investigator because he wrote letters to this investigator who has the apartment beneath him saying that my father planted him there and he's going to get us instead. But I'll have Peter or Tommy call you back. I'll call them at home. JJ, do you know how to spell the last guy's name? Not Chamberlain. 82. Interballo. Just like it sounds. JJ, okie dokie, honey. 82. Thank you a lot. JJ, thank you very much, dear. 82. Bye bye. This transcript of the actual conversation between Wheat Carr and Justice hasn't been made public before. It vividly shows what role the NYPD believed Berkowitz played in the Son of Sam saga and invalidates numerous police proclamations which followed the arrest, when authorities claimed they initially were highly suspicious of Berkowitz. Wheat Carr was a police and gun buff, owning a .357 Magnum and a .25 caliber revolver and a .22 caliber pistol. She has a mother named Frances and a black Labrador retriever named Harvey. She also had a brother named Michael, 24, a freelance advertising stylist photographer, a designer who was a ranking member of the Church of Scientology. At that minute, her other brother, 30-year-old John Carr, was on the road. New York was far behind him, and he crossed the Midwestern United States, angling north. John Carr had his reasons for vacating the metropolitan area, and his reasons involved David Berkowitz. After hanging up from her conversation with Justice, Wheat called her family home at 316 Warburton Avenue, a rambling, old three-story frame house where her father, Sam, operated an answering service. Warburton Avenue, once a thriving middle-class thoroughfare of private homes, apartment buildings, and small businesses, had gone downhill since the early 1960s. Its southern portion, in which the Carrs lived, was somewhat seedy. High above at Pine Street, the neighborhood changed for the better. David Berkowitz's building was newly renovated and well maintained, and commanded a majestic view of the Hudson. The apartment house, contrary to Wheat Carr's implications, was not situated very close to the Carr home. The impression given was that the two dwellings were practically back to back. Not so. About 200 hill yards consisting of trees and the Corton Aqueduct path and Grove Street separated Berkowitz's home apartment from the Carr home far below. Sam Carr, 64, a thin, gray-haired, chain-smoking, retired Yonkers public workers employee, who himself owned several guns, including revolvers, listened as his daughter repeated the essence of her exchange with Justice. Carr hung up and called Justice in Brooklyn about 2 hours later at 10:30 p.m. Wheat Carr reached Yonkers police officer Tom Chamberlain at his home, and Chamberlain too called Justice. Bit by bit, the NYPD was learning about the potential witness David Berkowitz, and the story Justice was hearing was a fascinating one. In mid-February 1976, David Richard Berkowitz, then employed as a guard with IBI Security, moved from a small apartment at 2161 Barnes Avenue in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx to a room over the garage in a private home of Jack and Nan Casada at 174 Coligny Avenue in New Rochelle, Westchester County, and Casares, an elderly couple, occupied the well-kept colonial house with their son, Steve, 19. The Cassandra's other children were grown and living their own lives in the Westchester area. Jack Casares, still short of retirement age, worked at the Neptune Moving Company in New Rochelle. Berkowitz, a model tenant, had complained about the barking of the Casada's German Shepherd dog, but otherwise was friendly and no bother to the family. He paid his $200 monthly rent on time. However, he abruptly moved from the Casada residence in April 1976, leaving his $200 security deposit behind. He'd been there only 2 months. Berkowitz left New Rochelle for apartment 7E on the top floor of 35 Pine Street in northwest Yonkers. Nobody seemed to know how he'd found the Casada home or the Pine Street address. His Yonkers rent was $237 a month, which he paid punctually. On May 13th, 1976, a Molotov cocktail firebomb was tossed at a second-floor bedroom window in the home of Joaquin Nito, 18 Wicker Street, Yonkers, a two-family wood frame house located down the hill from 35 Pine and no more than 50 yards south of the Carr home. Nito, his wife, Maria, her mother, and their daughter, Sylvia, 13, lived on the first 2 floors, and a construction worker occupied the top floor by himself. The Nitos received a number of abusive telephone calls and at least one threatening letter, which Mrs. Nito's mother destroyed. On October 4th, 1976, at about 4:40 a.m., someone threw a Molotov cocktail through a window in the Carr home. Sam Carr, awake at the time, extinguished the flames before the firefighters arrived. 11 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, the Nitos were entertaining a large gathering of family friends when several shots fired from a car through a chain-link fence fronted the house, slammed into the dwelling, barely missing a window behind which young Sylvia Nito was playing the piano. But on the front stoop, the family German Shepherd Rocket lay dead. A bullet from a small caliber weapon had sliced through its neck. On April 10th, 1977, Easter Sunday, a handwritten letter was mailed to Sam Carr, asking him to silence the barking of Harvey, the black Labrador retriever. On April 19th, another letter, written by the same hand, was sent to the Carr residence. This missive was more threatening in tone than the previous one. On April 27th, about 9:30 a.m., somebody made good on the threat. Harvey was wounded by one of the several shots pegged into the Carr backyard from the aqueduct path some 20 yards behind the house. Carr got a glimpse of a man in blue jeans and a yellow shirt running north on the aqueduct. The shooting was not done with a .44, as Wheat Carr implied it was. Next, on June 7th, Craig Glassman, a nursing student and volunteer deputy with Westchester County Sheriff's Department, received the first of 4 threatening letters mailed to his apartment at 35 Pine Street, where he'd moved out in March from around the corner on Glenwood Avenue to apartment 6E, directly below David Berkowitz. 2 days later, on July 9th, the Cassandra family in New Rochelle, Berkowitz's former landlords, received a get well card in the mail. The card, which was destroyed, with a drawing of a puppy, told Jack Casada, "Sorry to hear about the fall you took from the roof of your house." Casada had taken no such fall. The card was signed Sam Francis, and the envelope was embellished with the return address of the Carrs, whom the Casadas didn't know. Both annoyed and curious, Mrs. Casada located the listening for Sam Carr and phoned him to discover why the card was sent. The Carrs said they knew nothing about it, but Sam Carr told Nan Casada about the letters he'd received and the subsequent wounding of Harvey, who still had a large caliber bullet in his body. It was deemed too risky to remove it, Carr said. The two couples agreed to meet, and on June 9th at the Carr home in Yonkers, they compared the handwriting on the Carr letters with that on the Casada's Get Well card. The samples matched. Something was happening in Yonkers, something strange. The Carrs and Casadas had something or someone in common, but they couldn't decide who or what it was. Back at the home that evening, Nan Casada talked about the Yonkers visit with her son, Steve, hearing about the attack on the Carr's dog. Steve suggested, "Remember that tenant who didn't like our dog barking?" Maybe it's got something to do with him. Recalling the incident, but not the tenant's name, Nan Casada checked her records. David Berkowitz. She next looked in the Westchester telephone directory and noticed a listing for a David Berkowitz at 35 Pine Street in Yonkers. She phoned Sam Carr. Is Pine Street anywhere near you? She asked Bingo. The next day, June 10th, Carr went to the Yonkers Police Department Detective Division with the information he'd received to say the Yonkers detectives mishandled the case would be to understate the matter. But in short, nothing happened. This was on June 10th, 16 days before the Eliphas shooting and 7 weeks before the son of Sam attacked Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante. Volunteer Sheriff Deputy Craig Glassman, meanwhile, had carried his June 7th threatening letter to his superiors in White Plains. Nothing happened there either. Glassman received another mailed threat, postmarked July 13th. He again showed the letter to his superiors. If someone had bothered to check with Yonkers police, they would have learned the handwriting on Glassman's letter matched that on the Cassandra Get Well card and on the Carr's letters about Harvey, but no one bothered. But on Saturday, August 6th, a week after the Moskowitz Violante shooting, everyone began answering Reville's bugle. At 7:30 that morning, someone started a garbage fire in front of Glassman's door at 35 Pine Street and flung about 24 live rounds of .22 caliber bullets into the flames for good measure. Luckily, no one was injured. One of the Yonkers police officers who responded to the blaze was Tom Chamberlain, who was familiar with Carr and Casara correspondence. He asked Glassman if he'd received any mailed threats. Glassman showed him the 2 letters he'd received as of that morning, and Chamberlain immediately recognized the handwriting. This was not a monumental feat. Berkowitz's writing is distinctive and easily identifiable. And more than that, Glassman's June letter contained the return address of the Casadas, and July 13th note actually had Sam Carr's last name in it. Glassman notes also were spiced with references to blood, killing, and Satan. Suddenly, everybody wanted a piece of David Berkowitz. The stories related by Chamberlain and Sam Carr to the NYPD James Justice were of interest in the waning hours of August 9th. But despite the violence, gore, and bizarre conduct loose in Yonkers, the Brooklyn supervisors weren't overly impressed. Although they'd later claimed they knew thousands of borderline psychotics in New York, and Berkowitz, if he was indeed guilty of war being waged in Yonkers, might only be another in a long list of erratic citizens whose names were being forwarded to the Omega Task Force every day. Moreover, this blatant wild activity didn't fall at all. This blatant wild activity didn't at all jibe with numerous psychiatric portraits of a low-keyed killer who would melt into the crowd. On the surface, Joe ordinary. And that was and is an important point. The NYPD did not storm into Yonkers that night, nor would they unleash a battalion of detectives the next day. They'd send only two detectives to conduct a routine check of potential witnesses. Berkowitz, who was of interest because of the ticket and the allegation that he was now suspected of violent behavior involving a weapon as well. He didn't drive a yellow VW, the killer's car. He didn't borrow it. His own Ford was at the scene that night, but it was remotely possible he somehow switched vehicles. Anything was possible. It is interesting to note on Wednesday, August 10th, Police Commissioner Michael Codd was out of town. Not in Europe or China, just out of town. John J. Santucci, District Attorney of Queens, site of 5 of the 8 Son of Sam attacks, would later offer this observation. If you knew beforehand that you had identified your suspect, you would just not make the biggest arrest in the history of the police department without the commissioner available. It's simply not done. They didn't know until the very end it was Berkowitz they were after. At around noon on the 10th, Detective Sergeant James Shea of the 10th Homicide Zone asked veteran Detective Ed Zigo and John Longo to drive to Yonkers to look into the Berkowitz situation. Strano and Justice, who'd carried the issue to this point, were excluded from the excursion, another indication that Berkowitz wasn't believed to be the killer. If an arrest was thought possible, the two cops who built the case probably would have been on the scene. Arriving in Westchester, Zigo and Longo used a street map for reference and cruised along North Broadway in Yonkers, turned left on Glenwood, and proceeded down the hill to Pine Street. They stopped, walked around the area, and spotted Berkowitz's Galaxy parked on the west side of the narrow road about 25 yards north of the entrance of number 35. Zigo gazed through the car window and spied a duffel bag in the back seat. A rifle butt was protruding from the bag. There is no law in New York that prohibits possession of a rifle. Rifles aren't considered concealed weapons, and it isn't even necessary to obtain a license before owning one. Zigo, peering through the window, knew that. He also knew he couldn't see only a butt or the stock and nothing more. In other words, he had no reason to think any illegal material was in the vehicle. Regardless, he entered the car. Opening the duffel bag, he saw the rifle was a semi-automatic Commando Mark III, capable of firing 30 bullets from any of the assortment of clips that were also stashed in the duffel bag. The gun, although was not the type normally owned by hunters or average citizens, it was not illegal. Popping the glove compartment, Zigo came across an envelope addressed to Omega Commander Timothy Dowd and the Suffolk County, Long Island Police. Reading the enclosed note, Zigo knew what he'd found. The text, in longhand, promised an attack in Southampton, the exclusive summer resort on Long Island's South Shore, not far from Fire Island. Zigo and Longo were thunderstruck. They'd located the Son of Sam, or had they? David Berkowitz had spent an eventful, busy week. Plans were formulated and enacted. Wheels were set spinning. An elaborate mystique had to be created. It had been difficult to accomplish, but it was done. When Ziegel poked through the Ford, Berkowitz, whose apartment didn't face the street, paced the living area. Earlier that morning, he'd gone downstairs and put the duffel bag into the car and jammed it hastily, scrawled note into the glove compartment. The letter was written in longhand. There hadn't been time to copy the stylized, slanted block letter printing of Son of Sam. He'd also plagiarized a poem, apparently inspired by another individual, adapted it to Craig Glassman, wrote it on a manila folder, and drawn the Son of Sam graphic symbol beneath it. He sketched the symbol incorrectly, reversing the Mars and Venus signs positioned from the original use in the Breslin letter, and adding arrows to the ends of the X. A Yonkers police official would later find pieces of the paper on which Berkowitz practiced drawing the symbol. Berkowitz's printing also faltered in his attempt to mimic the Son of Sam method. Unlike the Breslin letters, which contained only capital letters, the ode to Glassman was sprinkled with several lowercase letters done in the normal Berkowitz style of printing. One would have thought Son of Sam knew his own techniques. The poem said, "Because Craig is Craig, so must the streets be filled with Craig death." And huge drops of lead poured down upon her head until she was dead. Yet the casts still come out at night to mate, and the sparrows still sung in the morning. But why all the haste and hurry with the poem and letter? David Berkowitz's source close to him say, knew that the police were coming to Yonkers that day. He'd been tipped off. The implications of this revelation are staggering. Was Berkowitz really alerted? At this point, it is perhaps better to answer that question with several other questions. Did a means exist through which Berkowitz could have been altered? Is it logical to believe that the infamous, ingenious Son of Sam, who'd eluded the biggest manhunt in New York history for so long, would leave a valuable, potentially incriminating weapon exposed in his own car, which was parked in front of his own home in broad daylight? And with that weapon so displayed, inviting a break-in such as Zigo's, would that killer then leave a Son of Sam letter easily within grasp of his glove compartment? And would he do so in light of a parking ticket he knew would eventually lead the police in his direction, knowledge that should have led him to be doubly cautious? In actuality, the initial preparations had been in the making since the day after the Moskowitz Violante shooting. The parking ticket, the sources close to him state, had assured Berkowitz of the nomination, and the VW chase had cemented his election. He couldn't claim an innocent reason for his presence in Bensonhurst, because doing so would have kept the police investigation centered on the yellow VW driver, who it would be learned was deemed more important in the conspiratorial hierarchy than David Richard Berkowitz. The police were after only one killer. Berkowitz could be tossed to the wolves as the result of his own mistake, and the truth could remain secret. Berkowitz, the sources say, wasn't all that happy with the situation, but he had no choice. At first, it was hoped there was a remote chance the police wouldn't investigate the ticket at all, and he had paid it immediately, but it was far more likely they would pursue the matter routinely, so Berkowitz had to be ready. On about August 4th, less than 1 week after the Brooklyn attack, Berkowitz, with some assistance from his accomplices, removed all possessions from the Pine Street apartment in the dead of night. They included a bed, a couch, a bureau, a dining set, and assorted clothing. An expensive Japanese-made stereo system he'd purchased while stationed with the army in Korea was disposed of by other means. The clothing and furniture was loaded into a van rented from a Bronx gas station and catered to the Salvation Army warehouse in Mount Vernon, Westchester County, about 5 miles from Pine Street. The contents were piled in front of the building where they could be discovered when the facility opened the next morning. Then a series of insane notes had to be written and strewn about the apartment to enhance the illusion of a lone, demented Son of Sam. These letters railed against the Casadas, the Pine Street neighbor, Sam Carr, and others. Next, a number of weird ramblings and obscenities about Sam Carr, demons, and Craig Glassman were slapped onto the apartment walls with magic marker. A hole was punched into one of the walls and surrounded by other bizarre writing. The intent was plain. He was to feign insanity, and the demonic possession angel provided in May by the NYPD itself would serve as the motive for the slayings. There were some mistakes made, but they would be missed or ignored by the police, who didn't concern themselves with any kind of follow-up investigation. It was, all in all, a brilliant hoax to pull the naive NYPD, but as Berkowitz would later write to me in a modest vein, it wasn't all my idea, and I'm certain you know this. The police, under intense pressure, were so desperate for an arrest they'd believe almost anything. Berkowitz was told, accurately, nobody would challenge the story because nobody who wants nobody would challenge the story because nobody would want to do so. Accurate again, police was involved, the city was in shambles. You can tell them anything, and they'll go for it just to bring this to an end. Berkowitz listened to the milk and honey, and he thought hard. There wasn't much he could do, so he bought the arguments about the police and the description of the police, and he agreed that he could get off on a not guilty by reasons of insanity plea and be put into a mental institution. There he was told he'd enter there he was told he'd either be released as a cured man in the 5 to 7 years time, or else his friends would break him out. He knew that part was bullshit, but it is not known what he thought. It is not known what he thought 15 months later, when, unknown to the public, a loaded 38 caliber revolver was mailed to him at the Central New York Psychiatric Center in Marcy. The package, postmarked in Bayside, Queens, was intercepted by Central officials before it reached Berkowitz's hands, but he knew it had arrived for him. As far as Berkowitz was concerned, on the afternoon of August 10th, 1977, everything had gone wrong since May. At that time, sources say, a meeting of conspirators was held and the possibility of someday having a donate a scapegoat to the police was discussed. No one was picked out then. Ideas were tossed back and forth, but nothing was resolved. It was thought that perhaps some innocent, hapless junkie could be set up. But Berkowitz made his own decision that day, and he began to implement it in June, immediately after the publication of the Son of Sam letter to Jimmy Breslin, a letter that tended to set up someone called John Wheaties, a rapist and suffocator of young girls, more than anyone else. But in Berkowitz's mind, there was one certain way to ensure he wouldn't be the fall guy. He'd get himself arrested for something else as a writer of threatening letters. Thus, carefully, calculatingly, he sent the get well card to Jack Casada with Sam Carr's return address on the envelope on the morning after the Breslin letter was printed on the Daily News. The very night he mailed the first threat to Glassman and put Casada's return address on this envelope, Berkowitz, in other words, wrote his own most recent former address on the threatening letter to his downstairs neighbor Glassman. Obviously, he was deliberately trying to loop around himself, linking himself to Casada, Glassman, Sam Carr, and the dog letters. He was the source's ad, confident that the Yonkers cops and Westchester Sheriff's Department would identify him and arrest him. He'd then be off the streets, effectively, probably under psychiatric observation, and out of the picture in the event of the Son of Sam setup. But to his dismay, nobody followed Berkowitz's explicit trail, not even when he wrote the second threatening letter to Glassman in mid-July, 16 days before the wildly heralded Death Day anniversary. In the second note, Berkowitz actually included Captain Sam Carr's name in the text. He even added Command Post 316 to the return address, and Carr lived at 316 Warburton Avenue. But once again, nothing happened. Berkowitz was amazed. He couldn't understand it. The Yonkers Police Department and Westchester investigators had to be totally incompetent, he decided. But Berkowitz didn't stop there. According to the sources, he simply shifted gears. After the Mockowitz murder, when it was determined he would be offered to the NYPD because of the ticket and the value of his VW driver, Berkowitz went all the way with the insanity scheme. While its original intent was to save him from the 44 arrest, he now, with the encouragement and counsel of his accomplices, used the already laid foundation to build an insanity defense to lessen his legal culpability for the crimes. In addition to the steps previously described, he mailed 2 more letters to Glassman in that final week, both on August 5th, and set the fire at the luckless depository's door the next morning. It was a period of frantic activity, and the fact alone is indicative that something was in the wind. For example, the last 2 notes to Glassman went much further than the preceding pair in June and July. True, I am the killer, one even claimed, and Sam Carr's full name and the return address were plastered across the envelope. It was as explicit as he could possibly be, Berkowitz knew, and it also linked him back to the other crazy letters and related incidents and was a definite boost to the now certain insanity scam. But it still wouldn't be enough to get him arrested by the Yonkers Police or Sheriff's Department. Why didn't Berkowitz run? He felt safer opting for police custody than with the prospect of hiding from his fellow conspirators, who specifically told him that his family members would be murdered if he crossed them and changed the plan, the sources say. His final preparatory move was to place the duffel bag and the Southampton letter in the car on the morning of the 10th after, the sources say, he received the tip that the NYPD was on the immediate horizon. But there was one more step, unknown to his mentors. He left behind, hidden in a pile of irrational ravings, the letter concerning at least 100 murders planned by the cult which he'd written before the Moskowitz killing. And he also left behind a list of fascinating phone numbers, just the numbers, no names attached. He was trying to cover all the bases. He'd be insane to claim responsibility for all the crimes, yes. But with little luck, the police would delve into the case and he'd come out an insane individual who was not responsible for all the shootings. That would be the best of both worlds. He was sure that the NYPD would check out the letter and the phone numbers and discover a trail that led to rather high places, but Berkowitz was wrong. The numbers wouldn't be investigated until they came into my hands in 1983. And they would lead to high places, but on August 10th, 1977, Berkowitz's work was done. It was almost time for the conclusion, as Berkowitz himself predicted with reason, just 5 days earlier in his final, anonymous threatening letter to Glassman. I believe that the end of the reign of terror is near. Ed Ziegel and John Longo, puppets in the game, rapidly retreated from Pine Street. Rushing to a telephone, Ziegel called his supervisors in Brooklyn. "We've got him," the tall, middle-aged detective reported. Sergeant Shea was not amused. "What the hell do you mean, you've got him?" Ziegel, an experienced second-grade detective, quickly explained the results of the Yonkers trip. When he mentioned earlier Berkowitz's car, Shea saw visions of the case bouncing out of the courtroom and down a stairway to the street. The 2 defendants were promptly ordered to stay away from Berkowitz's car, to take action only if they tried to drive away. Even then, they were advised not to arrest him, but instead hold him for questioning, a procedure that didn't require a warrant. In the meantime, the NYPD hierarchy would be informed of the sudden turn of events and support teams, and Berkowitz fit into his newly formed VW-less scenario, but they'd concern themselves with that letter. While Zigo a longo awaited assistance, the police telephone lines were humming. Inch by inch, level by level, the news from the outlying reaches of the hills of Yonkers snaked through the chain of command, ultimately reaching Chief of Detectives John Keenan and one police plaza in lower Manhattan. The 10th wasn't about to share this now probable arrest with Operation Omega, and Keenan backed them up. Borelli Coffey, Power, and Al were cut out, so were Joseph Strano and James Justice, the two detectives from the 10th itself who'd brought the Berkowitz matter to this point. Sergeant William Gardella, 34, a boyish-looking supervisor with a marked talent for police work. He was assigned to drive to Yonkers with detectives John Falotisio and Charles Higgins, also from the 10th Homicide Zone. Shea was ordered to remain at his desk in Brooklyn to coordinate the phones. At about 6 a.m., an aging, unmarked police car containing Higgins, Gardella, and Flatosio turned onto Glenwood Avenue, Pine Street, which ran one way north to south. Was about 75 yards down the incline. Standing near the corner of Glenwood and Pine was an NYPD contingent consisting of Zigo Longo, Deputy Inspector Bernard McRan, and Captain Harold Coleman, also from Brooklyn. The two supervisors had arrived in Yonkers shortly before the reinforcements from the 10th. McRan, who is in command, assessed the situation and recognized the need for a search warrant. He ordered Gardella to take charge on Pine Street and would leave Longo, Latosio, and Higgins with him. Zigo was instructed to accompany Mr. McRan, and Coleman to Yonkers Police Headquarters to begin paperwork that would be necessary to obtain rent from a Yonkers judge. Oh, I gotta read that over. Zigo was instructed to accompany McRand and Coleman to Yonkers Police Headquarters to begin paperwork that would be necessary to obtain a warrant from a Yonkers judge. At this moment, the Yonkers Police Department itself had no idea of what was beginning to unfold in the city. While the conference among the detectives was in session near the corner of Glenwood and Pine, neighborhood resident noted the obvious: there was police activity on the block. What an interesting way to pass a summer's twilight. They arrested. So out came the lounge chairs and folding chairs and lemonade and beer, and the good citizens of Glenwood and Pine Street settled back to enjoy the drama being performed in front of them, only it was more of a farce than a drama. 4 detectives would now be responsible for maintaining surveillance of large buildings which countless garbages, side doors, stairwells, and the like had at least 4 exits behind it. A wooden area dipped sharply towards Wicker Street, that Wicker, as in Wicker King Wicker, in the Breslin letter. The escape possibilities were numerous. Moreover, the public display of police pounding had alerted the neighborhood. Berkowitz himself might have seen them. The police didn't know if their suspect's apartment overlooked the river or the street. Beyond that, in the Breslin letter, The killer had suggested a blazing finale when he wrote, "Perhaps I will be blown away by the cops with smoking 38s. They'd already found a semi-automatic rifle in the car. What might he have in store in the apartment?" Considering the circumstances and background, the force left to monitor 35 Pine was small and ill-prepared. Gardella, cognizant of the predicament, told Higgins to join Falotisio in a car parked 2 autos behind Berkowitz's on the west side of Pine Street. His car's presence suggested Berkowitz was at home, but it was hardly conclusive. No one thought to call him and do a sorry wrong number routine to verify he was in fact inside the apartment. Excuse me. At about 6:30 p.m., a blue and white Yonkers police car turned onto Pine Street and stopped directly in front of Berkowitz's building. 2 uniformed cops, carrying paper bags, climbed from the car and walked into the lobby of the red brick apartment house. Gardella knew that the squad car's appearance could alarm Berkowitz. Agitated, the young sergeant radioed the NYPD on the detective band and asked that Yonkers be not notified and told to move the cruiser. And a few minutes later, the bewildered officers, who'd been on a dinner task break with a friend, came out, looked around uncertainly, and drove away. The incident altered Yonkers police to Pine Street Steakhouse. No one from the NYPD had advertised them beforehand of the activity. Shortly afterwards, the darkness of falling, and so was the elevator at 35 Pines as it slowly rumbled to the lobby inside the solitary passenger. Craig Glassman, now aware of Berkowitz's existence as the suspect in his apartment fire, Glassman had decided to play detective. The volunteer deputy ambled from 35 Pine, sauntered nonchalantly up the block, and stared into the passenger's window of Berkowitz's Ford. He'd been given the car's description and plate number of Yonkers officer Tom Chamberlain after Sunday's fire. Seeing Glassman at the car, Higgins and Falotosio, who, in another example of the wonderful state of police preparedness, didn't even know that what their suspect looked like, jumped from their auto, drew their guns, and raced down the street. In another auto, Gardella, Ziegel, Longo, Coleman, and McRan, who still hadn't left the block, watched it intently. The idly curious on their porches snapped to attention. Glassman, who didn't remotely resemble a single police sketch of the killer, finished his observations, turned from the Galaxy, and began heading back to his building. But New York's finest didn't know whom they were supposed to be grabbing at the moment. Notorious slayer of the city's history, supposed to be grabbing as the most notorious slayer in the city's history. "Hey, Dave, hold on a minute," Filatosio called out. It was the age-old police ploy. If he's the guy you want, he'll turn around, of course. Glassman turned around. Seeing the revolvers, he had second thoughts. I'm not David, he blurted. The dismayed detectives wanted proof, so Glassman cautiously reacted for his wallet. Cautiously reached for his wallet. It is depressing to contemplate what might have happened if Berkowitz chose that moment to emerge from 35 Pine. For one thing, lives could have been lost. After Glassman showed the detectives his identification, the disguised cops sent him away. Also disappointed, the neighbors suspectors the neighbors' spectators slumped back in their chains. False alarm. Glassman had assumed Falatosio Higgins and others were Yonkers police all ready to arrest Berkowitz for his fire at his door. He never thought to ask where they came from, and they hadn't bothered to tell him. Then Glassman went back inside and began to do his laundry. By 9 p.m., the jeans and hidden beneath a shirt that hung over his belt. In the interim, McRan and Coleman had left this area, and Zigo drove off to obtain a search warrant. Longo and Higgins were now stationed on the roof of 35 Pine, with Gadrella joined Falatosio in the car on the street. Seeing Glassman lumbered toward them, Gardella and Falatosio winced. Glassman leaned into the unmarked car and asked if he could be of assistance, reminding Gardella that there were numerous exits from 35 Pine. A valid point. Gardella, who in the real world was a good professional supervisor, was growing frustrated with the situation and by the awareness that he needed more help. NYPD brass were flocking to Yonkers Police Headquarters at this time, but the Pine Street outpost was a lonely one, and the 4 detectives and a volunteer deputy staking out the vicious son of Sam without a warrant to arrest him or search his persons or premises. Besides the non-support, Gardella, Falatosio, and their partners on the roof had the other little problems concerning their ignorance of the Berkowitz appearance. Falatosio, a veteran officer, asked Glassman if he could identify Berkowitz. Glassman told us, stocky, white-haired detective, that he'd caught a glimpse of the suspect driving his Ford at 37 and morning. I lost my place. Ford at 37 in the morning, and yes, he thought he could recognize him. Gardella then asked Glassman to hop into the police car, but Glassman, his superiors in the White Plains, before he could participate in any investigation, still not knowing he was dealing with NYPD and the Son of Sam case, Glassman went back to his apartment, phoned White Plains, and received approval to join this stakeout for whoever or whatever. The Pine Street grandstanders had by now grown weary of the Craig Glassman show, and most retired to their homes before he returned to street level about 9:45 a.m. When he climbed into the unmarked car, the radio suddenly broadcast a dispatch on the New York City detective band. Yonkers, it dawned on him. The suspicions voiced by Yonkers officers, Chamberlain and Intervallo, were right. Berkowitz had to be the Son of Sam. The so-called Son of Sam was ready for his fate. He donned a pair of blue jeans, a light-colored short-sleeved dress shirt with pinstripes and brown work boots. He put a 44 Bulldog, his 44 Bulldog, that is, into a piece of paper bag and slowly descended the stairs to his lobby of 35 Pine Wall. Walking through the glass door, he bounded up the steps to street level and began to stride north to his car. Unknown to him, the galaxy was hemmed in tightly. Gardella had earlier asked a neighbor to roll his van flush with the rear bumper of Berkowitz's car. With another auto barely 3 feet lost my place. Walking through the glass doors, he bounded up the steps to street level and began to stride north to his car. Unknown to him, the galaxy was hemmed in tightly. Gardella had earlier asked a neighbor to roll in his van flush with the rear bumper of Berkowitz's car. With another auto barely 3 feet in front of the Ford, Berkowitz wasn't going anywhere. It wouldn't have mattered, Berkowitz would later recall, that the car would have stalled had he tried to drive it in a hurry. It badly needed a tune-up. Not even looking around, Berkowitz entered the street, reached the driver's door, not of the Galaxy, opened it, and squeezed his fleshy frame behind the wheel. "Is it him?" Filatosio asked Glassman as Berkowitz neared the car. "I'm not sure. I can't say for certain." Glassman reportedly answered. At the Gardella and Filatosio had reached their limit. Followed by Glassman, they jumped from the car and ran along the sidewalk. Berkowitz's blind side, until they reached the rear of the Ford. Filatosio then cut to the street while Gardella crept into the passenger's window. Berkowitz, fumbling with the keys, found the ignition and started to crank the reluctant engine. He looked up to see Filatosio's .38 revolver pointing to his head on the passenger's side of the car. Gardella aimed, and his gun through the glass. Berkowitz looked at Filatosio and smiled. It was a long, slow, sweet, knowing smile. His blue eyes twinkled with amazement. Filatosio was shaking at the sight. "What the hell do I have here?" he wondered. Early editions of the next morning's Daily News were already on the street by the time Berkowitz was arrested at 10 p.m. Fortunately for her, Cecilia Davis, cowering in fear inside her Bay 17th Street apartment since the Makowitz's Violante attack, didn't see the first press runs. If she had, she might have boarded the first night. I lost my place. If she had, she might have boarded the first flight out of New York. The police, by leaking information to a reporter from the news, had potentially placed Miss Davis's life in danger. Although the origins of the material can't be proven, this much can be said. One of the 3 journalists who shared the August 11th byline was William Federici. He was said to be a close friend of Detective Joseph Strano, the homicide cop from the 10th who developed Mrs. Davis's story. On August 10th, which apparently was the day of the news received the confidential information, Strano was not sent to the scene in Yonkers. He remained in Brooklyn, still pushing his witnesses' value, and consequently his own in the investigation. Mrs. Davis was the owner of the White Spitz, the only such dog in her neighborhood. She and the police knew she'd seen a man believed to be the killer, and the man had certainly seen her, but had she gone to the police? Could she identify him? There was no way the man could know until the police leaked the following to the news. Police officers have been assigned as bodyguards for a middle-aged woman who came face to face with a man described as the .44 caliber killer. Before he struck on July 31st, the woman who was walking her dog told police she had seen a man with curly hair, dressed in light blue jeans, blue denim jacket, blue shirt, and deck shoes. The man acted strangely, and the woman went home feeling fearful. The message was clear. Mrs. Davis was a star witness, as was the case with Tommy Ziano 9 days earlier. The police jeopardized Mrs. Davis's safety. Several hours later, on August 11th, another chapter would be written in the Davis saga, but the first Son of Sam suspect would create his own news. David Berkowitz, guarded by Falotio and Detective Charlie Higgins, and with Craig Glassman in the front seat to provide directions, was driven to Yonkers Police Headquarters on St. Casimir Street to greet his public Timothy Dowd of the Omega Task Force and Chief Detective John Keenan. Sergeant Bill Gardella remained on Pine Street with Berkowitz's Ford, and John Longo went upstairs to maintain security outside apartment 7E. Pine Street was now evolving into a boisterous block party as residents poured from their homes. Other police from both Yonkers and the NYPD began arriving at the scene. Berkowitz had been arrested without a warrant. Ed Zigo, who was commissioned to acquire the crucial piece of paper, was still somewhere in the depths of Yonkers court system, waiting for Judge Robert Kakasi to sign the hastily composed request. Berkowitz had signed no resistance. Berkowitz had offered no resistance. When he looked up to see the revolvers pointing into his face, he'd come quietly. "You got me," he wisely said. Then he uttered a fascinating comment. "What took you so long?" In the parking lot at the Yonkers Police Department, Dowd approached Berkowitz and asked him if he knew whom he was speaking to. Berkowitz shocked Dowd by replying in a calm and friendly manner. "Sure, you're talking Inspector Dowd. I know who you are." Like Falotio, Dowd was taken aback by the relaxed demeanor Berkowitz displayed. After an expected amount of confusion and some brief, off-the-record questioning at Yonkers Police Department, David Berkowitz, charged with unlawful possession of a firearm, the legal .45 semi-automatic rifle, and a convoy assembled for the victorious journey to police headquarters in Manhattan. First, however, Berkowitz had to tell police where the all-important .44 Bulldog was. In all the excitement, the gun was left behind in the galaxy. The weapon was hastily retrieved. Mayor Abe Beame, asleep at Gracie Mansion, was awakened and told of the arrest. Beame issued a statement that said, "The people of New York can rest easily this morning because the police have captured the person known as Son of Sam." Berkowitz had yet to be questioned formally, and the first prejudicial bricks were already being laid. There would be many more for the police and the media. Berkowitz would essentially be convicted before he opened his mouth. The Berkowitz bandwagon was rolling now. His mentors had been correct. The New York officials were so desperate for a solution to the case that they'd accept almost anything or anyone. When the suspect arrived at one police plaza, he was welcomed by an overflowing mob of photographers, reporters, camera crews, and curious cops and citizens. Hundreds of police barred the path as Gardella and Felatosio, who were now joined by a camera conscious Ed Zigo, struggled to escort a smiling David Berkowitz through the sea of flashing lights and flying questions. Berkowitz, as he would say later, was smiling with amusement at the photographers, fighting for favored positions for which to capture the image of this now recognizable terror for the front pages and television screens throughout the world. The night-stalking phantom suddenly had a face and a name and background. With Berkowitz's arrival at the rear of one police plaza, TV programs were interrupted by bulletins in cities as far as New York and Los Angeles, London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt, Germany. The next night, for example, ABC's network newscast would devote more than a half of its nationwide broadcast to the arrest. The tight formats of the network newscasts usually allow even major stories only a minute or two of airtime. Berkowitz also became headline news in a multitude of foreign newspapers, in addition to those in the United States. Further, he would appear on the cover of Newsweek and be featured prominently in Time, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the two big Chicago dailies, and hundreds of other newspapers and magazines. In New York, where Son of Sam would remain a front-page story for years to come, the Post and Daily News would break all previous circulation records with their coverage of the arrest. The news hastily published on... Oh crap, I lost my place. In New York, where Son of Sam would remain a front-page story for years to come, the Post Daily News would break all previous circulation records with their coverage of the arrest. The News hastily published an extra edition, and the Post bannered the headline, "Caught," in red ink across the front page above a large photo of the suddenly infamous postal clerk. In the New York Times, the story of the arrest dominated the page one and continued across two entire pages inside. At year's end, the story of Son of Sam would be chosen by wire service executives as the ninth biggest story in the world that year, dwarfing countless other political, military, social, and economic events. The biggest case was reaping the biggest publicity. But even as the photographers jockeyed for the strategic points from which to record his essence on film, there was a feeling about this suddenly real suspect of David Berkowitz that drifted through the crowd, a feeling of disbelief. Many who were there that night stated even then that something didn't seem right. Familiar with police composite sketches and generally knowledgeable about other aspects of the investigation, some media members on the scene were hit with the gut reaction that something was wrong. Berkowitz didn't seem to fit at all. But the police would endeavor to take care of those doubts in a hurry. This was now to be a police performance in the grandest scene. The triumphant entrance of The triumphant entrance to Police Plaza was itself a tip-off as to what was going on. There was no regard for security. Berkowitz could have been shot, quite simply, by anyone who had mind to do so. He wasn't sneaked into the building. He was paraded in front of the journalists and anyone else who happened to be there. In addition, Berkowitz was arrested by Brooklyn detectives for a Brooklyn crime. What was he doing at Police Plaza in Manhattan? Not a single Son of Sam shooting occurred in Manhattan. Maybe he was there because it was easier for the networks, newspapers, and wire services, and the mayor to convince the Police Plaza than at the 10th homicide in the Coney Island section of Brooklyn, while the police awaited the arrival of the mayor to preside over a late-hour press conference at which Berkowitz's guns and other paraphernalia would be displayed. The suspect himself was taken upstairs where he was subjected to all of a half hour's worth of informal questioning by about 10 detectives who competed for the chance to query the most infamous criminal in New York history. Berkowitz allegedly had been advised of his rights, and he reportedly answered the superficial questions put to him. However, there apparently was no recording or transcript made of the 30-minute chit-chat with the police. In effect, it was off the record. 8 attacks had occurred, 13 people were shot, and 6 of those were dead. The police questioning of Berkowitz by any professional standard should have lasted many hours. The detectives would have allocated more time to question a routine mugging suspect, and the questioning certainly should have been on the record. But the police didn't care. Berkowitz sat there and said he did it all and was commanded to do so by old Sam Carr, who was really a 6,000-year-old man who spoke to David through his demon dog, Harvey. The police promptly leaked mountains of information about Berkowitz's insanity and soul guilt to the media. All of this was based on 30 minutes of bedlam, but it served its purpose. The newspapers, radio, and TV stations ate it up, and by the next morning, amid the champagne corks popping as the police celebrated, Berkowitz's fate was sealed. He was guilty. He was alone, and he was crazy, and he had still not formally confessed to anything. After the sessions with the detectives, it was finally time for Berkowitz's final statement to be made to representatives of the district attorneys of Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. The questioning would be conducted by assistant district attorneys, but one DA, John Santucci of Queens, made an appearance, and he didn't like what was going on. I wasn't happy with the appearance, and he didn't like what was going on. I wasn't happy with the whole case from the minute they brought Berkowitz in and I saw him. Santucci would tell me 3 years later I had questions I wanted answers to, and I had doubts that they were troubling me. It was all too smooth, too easy. I didn't like it. Santucci must have blanched the next day when he saw a New York Post photo of a beaming Timothy Dowd writing "Case closed" across a police blackboard, "Case closed," the night of the arrest. Berkowitz's confession would begin officially at 3:28 a.m. on August 11th. The packed downstairs press conference was over. Berkowitz was on his way to international celebrity and soul guilt, and only now were the assistant district attorneys gathering to interrogate him on the record. Berkowitz, my sources would say, had rehearsed his lines and, as an active conspirator knew enough details to satisfy any surface questioner. He was hoping that with the immense pressure to bring the case to an end, the interrogation would be light. Too much detail could blow the whole thing wide apart. Berkowitz needn't have worried. The questioning would be superficial and devoid of trick questions designed to trap a false confessor in a lie. Berkowitz's answers would contain numerous factual errors, but they would not be challenged. To the contrary, officials would tell the media that Berkowitz had given them a detailed blow-by-blow description of the crimes. Laziness.